The crack of the slap echoed through Latoyle's dining room like a gunshot, silencing the clinking of silver and the hum of Soul's Elite. Beck Jaw's diamond-encrusted hand was still trembling with rage as she looked down at Kiera, a black waitress recoiling on the marble floor. Red wine stained Kiera's white uniform, but it was the humiliation, witnessed by the wealthiest eyes in Gangnam, that cut the deepest. What this socialite didn't know was that the woman she just called disposable was the fiancée of CEO Jin Hwa, the ghost king of the Korean underworld. And in the shadows of the restaurant he secretly owned, Jin Hwa's phone was already vibrating with a high-priority alert. Someone had just put their hands on his queen. In less than 24 hours, Jin Hwa would systematically dismantle Beck Jaw's entire world, her luxury boutiques, her family's offshore accounts, and the social standing she valued more than life itself. All because she made one fatal mistake. She assumed that power only wears a designer suit. But the real shock wasn't the total destruction of a legacy. It was the moment Jin Hwa stepped into the light to show the world that real power doesn't react, it decides. This is the true story of how one slap at a dinner table triggered a landslide that buried a family's reputation and turned a humble waitress into the most protected woman in Korea. By the end of this, you'll understand why the woman who tried to ruin a career is now a social pariah, and why the Ghost King chose a revenge far more clinical and devastating than a bullet. Before we get into the cold-blooded audit, and trust me, it's coming, hit that subscribe button. We're dropping more stories of power reversals and underground justice, and you're not going to want to miss what happens when the wrong person is crossed. What do you think is the first thing Jin Hwa will take from her? Leave your predictions in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video if you're ready for the takedown. Now, let's get into it. The sound of the slap was sharper than the breaking glass, a dry, stinging crack that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Kiera Mitchell didn't feel the pain immediately. Instead, she felt the world tilt. Her knees hit the cold, unyielding marble, and the world became a blur of white designer silk and the deep, suffocating red of the spilled Bordeaux. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wine dripping from the edge of the mahogany table, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap that felt like a countdown. Kiera stared at the shattered remnants of the crystal stemware. In her mind, the calculation started automatically, the practiced, defensive math of a woman living in a world that wasn't built for her. The glass was $200. The vintage wine was $3,000. Her weekly paycheck wouldn't even cover the dry cleaning for the woman standing over her. But as the sting on her cheek began to burn, blooming into a heat that radiated toward her ear, a different calculation took over. What was the cost of the glass compared to the cost of the look in Beck Jia's eyes? The socialite stood there, her arms still extended, her face a mask of elegant, terrifying fury. To Jia, Kiera wasn't a person. She was a malfunctioning piece of furniture, a stain to be bleached out. Do you have any idea what this suit costs, you clumsy animal? Jia's voice was a low, melodic poison that carried to every corner of the silent restaurant. You people come here and think you can touch things that don't belong to you. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Kiera didn't look up. She couldn't. She was focused on the wine spreading across her own white button-up, a cheap polyester blend that she had ironed so carefully that morning. She thought about her rent, her visa status, and the 3 years she had spent bowing and smiling until her back ached. She thought about how many times she had swallowed her pride like a bitter pill just to keep a seat at a table that would never be hers. Is this it? She wondered, her breath hitching in her chest. Is this the price of staying? She felt the weight of the room's attention. 100 pairs of eyes, all wealthy, all silent, all watching to see if the servant would apologize for being struck. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the tray she had been carrying. It was the realization that in this cathedral of wealth, her dignity had a market value of zero. I'm sorry about the wine, ma'am, Kiera whispered, her voice cracking. Jia stepped forward, the the gold hardware on her red handbag glinting like a weapon under the amber chandeliers. You will be more than sorry. I want you fired. I want you blacklisted. I want you to remember the day you thought you could breathe the same air as my family without consequences. Kiera finally lifted her head. Her braids were disheveled, one side of her face beginning to swell, but her eyes were clear. She looked at the diamond ring on Jia's finger, the same one that had just cut her lip, and then past her into the dim shadows of the corner booth. There, seated in a wide, grounded stance, was the man in black. CEO Jinhua hadn't moved. He hadn't gasped. He sat with his arms crossed, his face a chilling, unreadable slate of stone. To anyone else, he looked like just another wealthy diner board by a public scene. But Kiera saw the way his fingers tightened against his sleeves. She saw the Ghost King looking not at the woman who had struck her, but at the stain on Kiera's apron, as if he were already deciding how much blood it would take to wash it clean. In that moment, the internal monologue shifted. The cost of the spill didn't matter anymore. The glass was broken, and it could never be mended. And as Jinhua slowly began to uncross his arms, Kiera realized that Baek Jia had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. The price of Kiera's dignity had just been set, and before the sun rose over Seoul, Jinhua would make sure the Ice Queen of Gangnam paid it in full, with interest. The silence that followed Baek Jia's tirade was not the silence of a room ignoring a scene. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a natural disaster. It started at the waiter's station and rippled outward, a cold front that froze the movement of every server, sommelier, and busboy in the building. They weren't looking at the red wine on the floor or the swelling on Kiera's cheek. Their eyes were fixed on the corner booth, where the shadow had finally begun to move. CEO Jinhua stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He rose with a predatory grace that made the high-backed velvet chair seem like a throne he was vacating only to deal with a minor pest. As he stepped into the amber light of the main floor, the restaurant manager, a man who usually moved with the practiced arrogance of a minor king, turned a shade of gray that matched the linen napkins. His hands began to shake so violently he had to tuck them behind his back. Jia, still riding the high of her own perceived dominance, didn't notice the shift. She was too busy adjusting her pearl bracelet, her face twisted in a look of triumphant disgust. "Well," she demanded, looking at the manager, "why is she still on the floor? Call security. I want her dragged out, and I want the owner of this establishment on the phone this instant. My husband is a major investor in the hotel group that the owner is already here." The voice was low, a resonant baritone that felt like a vibration in the floorboards. Jinhua stopped 5 feet behind Jia. He didn't look at her. His gaze was anchored on Kiera, who was still kneeling among the glass shards, her hand pressed against her burning face. Jia spun around, her eyes flashing with a fresh wave of entitlement. "And who are you? An associate of this person? I suggest you stay out of things that don't." The words died in her throat as she finally looked at him, truly looked at him. Jinhua was dressed in a suit that cost more than her red handbag, but it wasn't the wealth that stopped her heart. It was the aura of absolute, terrifying stillness. He stood with his arms now at his sides, his fingers relaxed, but his eyes held the clinical coldness of a man who decided which lives were worth keeping and which were mere overhead. Beside them, the manager collapsed into a deep, trembling bow, the kind of bow reserved for royalty or a god of death. "Chairman CEO," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own teeth chattering. I apologize. I will handle this immediately. Please, let us move you to a private." "You will handle nothing," Jinhua said, his voice cutting through the manager's frantic rambling like a blade through silk. The entire restaurant had reached a state of total paralysis. Diners at neighboring tables sat with forks suspended midair, their faces pale as the realization hit them. The Ghost King was in the room. This wasn't a celebrity or a CEO. This was the man who owned the shadows they walked through. The silence was so deep that the sound of a single drop of wine hitting the marble sounded like a drumbeat. Jinhua took a step forward, and for the first time in her life, Baek Jia instinctively retreated. Her heels clicked frantically against the marble as she moved back, her Ice Queen facade cracking. She looked around for her friends, for the public witness she had thrived on only moments ago, but she found only stone-faced judgment. The room had turned. The social hierarchy she lived by had just been overwritten by a much older, darker law. Jinhua didn't spare her a second glance. He walked directly to Kiera. He ignored the broken glass, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the shards as he knelt in the spill. "Kiera," he said, and the name sounded like a prayer in the middle of a graveyard. He reached out, his hand steady and warm, and gently took her wrist to pull her away from the glass. "Look at me." Kiera lifted her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and the lingering sting of tears. She saw the man she loved, the man who cooked her simple meals in a quiet apartment and listened to her talk about her dreams, transformed into the terrifying figure the city whispered about. But in his eyes, she saw only the Danny she knew. "I told you," he whispered, loud enough for only her to hear. "I told you that you didn't have to carry the world on your shoulders anymore." He stood up, effortlessly pulling her to her feet with him. He kept his arm around her waist, anchoring her against his side. Then, and only then, did he turn his gaze to Baek Jia. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the look a gardener gives a weed before pulling it by the root. "You wanted to see the owner," Jinhua said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made everyone in the room feel like they were standing on a ledge. "I am CEO Jinhua, and you just struck my wife." The red handbag slipped from Jia's fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The diamond ring that had cut Kiera's lip now seemed like a lead weight on her hand. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but the Ghost King had already turned back to Kiera. The restaurant was silent, but the air was screaming with the weight of what was coming. The shadow had moved, and for Baek Jia, the sun was about to set forever. The word wife hung in the air like a sentence of execution, turning the heat of Baek Jia's indignation into a sudden, bone-chilling frost. She stood paralyzed, her designer heels feeling like they were sinking into the marble floor. In the silence of the restaurant, the only sound was the soft, expensive rustle of Jinhua's silk suit as he shifted his weight. Jinhua didn't look at the socialite. He didn't even acknowledge the gasps of the surrounding tables. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a silk handkerchief, pristine and white. With a gentleness that felt almost alien in the presence of his terrifying aura, he reached out and touched Kiera's chin, tilting her face toward the light. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice low and intimate, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Kiera looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was still in shock, caught between the sting of the slap and the impossible reality of Danny. Her Danny, standing in this room as a king. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. Jinhua didn't respond. He began to dab at her split lip with the silk, his focus so absolute that it was as if Baek Jia had ceased to exist. To the Ice Queen of Gangnam, this was a level of humiliation she had never encountered. She was used to being the center of every storm, the focus of every eye. Being screamed at would have been a battle she knew how to fight. Being ignored was an erasure. "Chairman CEO," Jia stammered, her voice thin and desperate. I didn't know." There was a spill, and the girl. Jinhua moved the handkerchief to Kiera's hand, wiping away a smear of red wine with methodical precision. He acted as if the woman speaking was nothing more than a draft in the room. He wasn't just protecting Kiera, he was elevating her by making her the only thing worthy of his attention. "The manager tells me your husband is an investor," Jinhua said, still looking only at Kiera's hand. His voice was calm, which only made the threat more visceral. "I don't like my business partners having poor taste in company. It suggests a lack of judgment that usually leads to financial ruin." Jia's face went from pale to a sickly, ash gray. She reached for her luxury red handbag on the floor, her fingers trembling so much she could barely grip the gold hardware. She was a woman who lived by the rules of status, but she was suddenly realizing that she had brought a butter knife to a nuclear standoff. Kiera, Jinhua continued, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The woman in the white suit is trying to apologize. But I don't hear anything. Do you? Kiera looked at Jia. For the first time, she saw the socialite clearly, without the filter of her wealth or the intimidation of her designer clothes. She saw a small, panicked woman clutching a bag as if it were a life raft. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished. I am so sorry, Jia blurted out, the words stumbling over each other. Please, I will compensate her. I will pay for everything. I'll buy her a new uniform. 10 new uniforms. I'll donate to any charity. Jinhua finally turned his head. It was a slow, mechanical movement that made the room hold its collective breath. He didn't look at Jia's face. He looked at the red handbag she was clutching. That bag, Jinhua said, his eyes narrowing. It's a limited edition. Crocodile skin, gold-plated hardware. It costs $40,000. And yet, it looks like a cheap imitation compared to the dignity of a woman you just struck. He took this silk handkerchief, now stained with a small drop of Kiera's blood, and casually dropped it onto the red handbag. It was a gesture of supreme contempt, treating her $40,000 accessory like a waste bin for a soiled rag. Take your things and leave, Jinhua said, the lack of emotion in his voice more terrifying than a roar. Don't bother with the check. I don't take money from people I'm about to erase. Jia didn't wait for a second warning. She turned and fled, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven beat against the marble as she scrambled toward the exit. She didn't look back at her friends or her abandoned dinner. She ran like a woman who could already feel the walls of her life starting to close in. The restaurant remained silent long after the doors had swung shut behind her. Jinhua turned back to Kiera, the lethal coldness in his eyes melting back into the warmth she knew. He tucked a stray braid behind her ear, his touch a silent promise. You're done for the night, he said, loud enough for the trembling manager to hear. And tomorrow, you're not coming back to a server station. You've served these people long enough. It's time they learn how it feels to serve you. Kiera stood in the center of the room, the red wine on her apron a badge of the life she was leaving behind. She looked at the man in black, and for the first time, she wasn't calculating the cost of a spill. She was calculating the weight of a crown. The black-tinted windows of the restaurant were a one-way mirror into a world that was already ending for the Beck family. Inside the dimly lit corner booth, the air hummed with the soft, rhythmic tapping of keys. Jinhua's personal digital forensics team didn't look like soldiers. They were young men in tactical spectacles and dark hoodies, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of encrypted tablets. To the Ghost King, information was the highest caliber of ammunition, and the audit had begun the moment Kiera's blood touched the marble, while the restaurant staff frantically moved to clear the table, polishing away the wine stains and gathering the shattered crystal. The digital ghost of Beck Jia was being pulled apart in the shadows. To a woman like Jia, life was a series of carefully curated images and expensive gatekeepers. But to Jinhua's team, she was merely a collection of unsecured servers, offshore routing numbers, and a long trail of deleted but recoverable sins. Sir, the lead analyst whispered, leaning toward Jinhua without taking his eyes off the scrolling green text. We've breached the server for the Beck Fashion Group. It took 4 minutes. Their firewall was as arrogant as the owner, expensive but hollow. Jinhua sat with Kiera, his hand never leaving hers. He didn't look at the screen. He knew what they would find. People who felt entitled enough to strike a stranger in public almost always felt entitled to steal from the state and crush their subordinates in private. Give me the highlights, Jinhua commanded, his voice as cold as the ice melting in the abandoned water glasses. It's a gold mine of malpractice, Chairman, the analyst replied. We found 2 sets of books for the Gangnam flagship store. They've been underreporting luxury import taxes for 5 fiscal years. The discrepancy is roughly 12 billion won. But that's just the math. The human cost is worse. He swiped a finger across the screen, bringing up a hidden folder labeled Personnel Adjustments. There are 17 non-disclosure agreements signed in the last 18 months, all from former stylists and junior assistants. The complaints are identical: verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and forced resignations without severance. We even found a voice recording a desperate intern kept, Gia screaming at her to eat the discarded fabric of a ruined gown. Kiera listened, her grip tightening on Jinhua's hand. The sting on her cheek felt like a minor injury compared to the systematic cruelty being revealed. She realized then that she wasn't just a random victim. She was merely the latest person to fall under a tread that had been crushing people for years. Notify the National Tax Service, Jinhua said, his tone devoid of any heat. Use the anonymous whistleblower protocol, but ensure the metadata is undeniable. And the NDAs, reach out to every one of those 17 women. Tell them their silence has been bought back. Tell them the Ghost King is paying for their legal counsel, and they are to file a class action suit by 10 a.m. tomorrow. The analyst nodded, his fingers flying across the screen as he sent the commands that would trigger a financial landslide. In the time it took for a busboy to lay a fresh white tablecloth over the site of the assault, Baek Jia's empire was effectively decapitated. Her credit lines were being frozen by algorithmic red flags, and the Ice Queen's reputation was being prepped for a public execution. The audit is complete, sir, the lead analyst said, closing his tablet with a final, echoing snap. The first wave of freezing orders will hit her husband's accounts in 2 hours. By dawn, the Beck name will be toxic to every bank in Seoul. Jinhua finally looked up, his gaze settling on the empty space where Jia had stood only 20 minutes ago. The retribution was clinical, bloodless, and absolute. He wasn't just taking her money. He was stripping away the only thing that gave her the courage to be cruel. He turned to Kiera, the lethal focus in his eyes softening just for her. The world thinks she's powerful because she has a title and a bag, he said softly. But real power is the ability to take it all back in the time it takes to have a cup of tea. She wanted to blacklist you, Kiera. Now, the city is going to blacklist her. As they rose to leave the restaurant, the manager bowed, so low his forehead nearly touched the ground. The audit was moving like a virus through the city's fiber optic veins, and for Baek Jia, the 24-hour clock was already ticking toward zero. The transition from the restaurant floor to the center of the room felt like a coronation held in the middle of a battlefield. The Ghost King did not lead Kiera out through a back exit like a secret to be hidden. He walked her directly through the gauntlet of Seoul's most powerful families. The air in Latoil was thick with a new kind of tension. Not the chaotic energy of Jia's outburst, but the heavy, reverent hush that accompanies the arrival of the storm. Jinhua stopped in the center of the grand foyer, beneath a chandelier that cast fractured, diamond-like light over the crowd. He turned to face Kiera, and as he did, the elite guests, the CEOs, the politicians, and the socialites who had watched the slap with bored indifference, found themselves holding their breath. They were looking at a man who usually existed only in whispers, a man whose presence in a room meant that the rules of polite society were officially suspended. Kiera, Jinhua said, his voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence. He reached into the inner pocket of his black suit and withdrew a small, velvet-lined box. The room seemed to tilt as he opened it. Inside sat a ring that didn't just sparkle, it commanded the light. It was a rare, deep blue Ceylon sapphire, surrounded by a halo of pear-cut diamonds that looked like shards of frozen starlight. It was a piece of jewelry that didn't just represent wealth, it represented a claim. Jinhua took her hand, his fingers steady and warm against her skin, which was still cooling from the adrenaline of the assault. He didn't ask for permission. He took her hand with the certainty of a man who had already moved mountains to reach this moment. As he slid the platinum band onto her finger, the weight of the stone felt like a physical anchor, grounding her in a reality that was shifting second by second. You spent tonight serving people who don't deserve to be in your presence, Jinhua said, his eyes locked onto hers, ignoring the sea of pale faces around them. From this moment on, you're not a guest in this city. You're the reason this city stays standing. You're the fiancé of CEO Jinhua, and anyone who forgets that will find out exactly how short my memory for mercy is. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles just above the sapphire. The gesture was old world, sophisticated, and utterly terrifying to everyone else in the room. By placing that ring on her hand in front of these witnesses, he wasn't just announcing an engagement. He was issuing a universal restraining order. He was marking her as untouchable, wrapping her in the invisible, lethal shroud of the Ghost King's protection. Kiera looked down at the ring, the deep blue of the sapphire matching the darkening sky outside. The sting on her cheek was still there, a faint, pulsing reminder of the woman in the white suit, but the shame had vanished. She looked at the guests, the women who had looked through her and the men who had ignored her, and saw them for what they were, spectators at a play they no longer understood. "The car is waiting," Jinhua whispered, his arm once again finding its place around her waist. As they walked toward the heavy oak doors, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one dared to even offer a congratulation. To speak would be to acknowledge they were standing in the presence of a predator who had just claimed his mate. The restaurant manager stood by the door, bowing so low he was nearly doubled over. He didn't look at Kiera as a waitress he had failed to protect. He looked at her as the future owner of his very soul. As the cool night air hit them, Kiera felt the weight of the sapphire on her hand. The audit was already destroying Baek Jia's life, but the ring was doing something more permanent. It was the end of the Kiera Mitchell who had to apologize for a spill, and the birth of a woman who would never have to bow again. The Ghost King had placed his crown on her finger, and for the first time in her life, Kiera felt the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of being the one who decided what happened next. The morning sun rose over Gangnam with a cold, judgmental clarity that Baek Jia had never noticed before. By 6 a.m., her smartphone had become a vibrating instrument of torture. The alerts weren't the usual invitations to gallery openings or private trunk shows. They were digital death certificates. Her primary credit card had been declined by her grocery delivery app, then her secondary. By 7 a.m., she received a formal email from the membership board of the Royal Orchid Club, the most exclusive social circle in the city, notifying her that her privileges had been indefinitely suspended due to a sudden reassessment of her alignment with the club's values. Jia sat in her silk robes, her hands shaking as she tried to call her closest friend, Choi Hannah. They had spent a decade together at the pinnacle of the social pyramid, sharing secrets and champagne. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. This time, the call was blocked. She realized then that the Ghost King didn't need to use a single bullet. He was simply turning off the lights to her world. By noon, the social death had moved from the digital to the physical. Desperate to reclaim some sense of normalcy, Jia dressed in a vintage Chanel suit and drove to her favorite boutique in Cheongdam-dong. She needed the comfort of the staff's subservience and the weight of a shopping bag to remind her who she was. But as she approached the heavy glass doors, the manager, a woman who had bowed to Jia for years, personally turned the open sign to closed. "There's a private event, Mrs. Beck," the manager said through the glass, her eyes devoid of their usual forced warmth. "We cannot accommodate you today, or any other day. Do you know who I am?" Jia shrieked, her voice cracking in the quiet street. "We know exactly who you are," the manager replied calmly, "and we have been instructed that our insurance does not cover the liabilities associated with your presence." Jia retreated to her car, her heart hammering against her ribs. She checked her social media, hoping for a shred of support, only to find that she had been unfollowed by every influential name in her contact list. The video of the slap had surfaced. Not the grainy security footage, but a high-definition, multi-angle masterpiece that made her look like a frantic, aging villain. The comments weren't just angry, they were clinical. People were calling for boycotts of her husband's companies, and for the first time, her name was being linked to tax irregularities in national headlines. She was being erased. The high society world she had spent her life cultivating was a fortress built of glass, and CEO Jinhua had just thrown the first stone. By evening, her husband finally returned home. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the hollow exhaustion of a man who had watched his net worth evaporate in 10 hours. "The banks have called in our personal loans," he said, his voice a flat, dead thing. They cited reputational risk. "Our accounts are being audited by the NTS as we speak. I've been asked to step down from the board by tomorrow morning." "But why?" Jia whispered, clutching her red handbag as if it were a shield. "It was just a waitress. She was nobody. She was the Ghost King's fiancée." Her husband barked, finally snapping. "And because of your nobody, we are now the nobodies. No one will take my calls. Even the driver quit an hour ago. He said he didn't want to work for a woman who doesn't know how to keep her hands to herself." Jia looked out the window of her penthouse, seeing the neon lights of the city she used to rule. The boutiques were closed to her. The clubs were barred. Her friends were gone like smoke in a high wind. She was still in her designer suit, still surrounded by her luxury goods, but she was a ghost in her own life. The Ice Queen had been cast out into the cold, and for the first time, she realized that without the status she had used as a weapon, she was nothing but a lonely woman in a white suit that was starting to feel like a shroud. The atmosphere in the boardroom of the Beck Fashion Group didn't just feel heavy. It felt like a tomb that had been sealed from the outside. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping view of the Seoul skyline, but the men and women seated around the mahogany table weren't looking at the horizon. They were staring at the balance sheets that had turned a jagged, bleeding red overnight. At the head of the table, Beck, Jia's husband, Chairman Beck, sat with his head in his hands. The silence of the room punctuated only by the frantic, muted vibrations of legal advisors' phones. The heavy double doors swung open with a synchronized click that made the directors jump in their seats. Usually, a meeting of this magnitude required a flurry of assistants and a parade of binders, but only two people walked through the entrance. The first was CEO Jinhua. He didn't lead. He walked half a step behind Kiera Mitchell, his presence a dark, protective shadow that signaled he was here as secondary support for the woman in front. Kiera didn't walk like a waitress navigating a crowded dining room anymore. She moved with a measured, lethal grace, her heels striking the carpet with a sound that felt like a countdown. She was no longer wearing the cheap polyester vest or the apron stained with wine. Today, she wore a custom-tailored power suit in midnight navy, the fabric catching the light with a subtle, expensive sheen that made Jia's previous Ice Queen attire look like a department store imitation. The salon sapphire on her finger caught the morning sun, flashing a deep, imperial blue as she pulled out the chair directly opposite the chairman. Beck Jia was there, too, slumped in a corner chair like a discarded doll. She looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized the nobody she had struck. The sight of Kiera in a suit that cost more than her husband's quarterly dividends was a final, crushing blow to her reality. "The board is in session," Jinhua said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to vibrate the water glasses on the table. He didn't sit. He stood behind Kiera, his hands resting on the back of her chair, a visual reminder that he was the muscle behind the mind. Kiera opened a single, slim leather portfolio. She didn't look at Jia. She didn't even look at the chairman. She looked at the board members, many of whom had been at the restaurant the night of the assault. 24 hours ago, this company was a legacy, Kiera began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying the weight of a woman who had spent years listening to the elite and finally knew exactly how they broke. Today, it is a liability. Your import licenses have been flagged for investigation. Your primary creditors have moved your debt to a high-risk category. And by noon, the class action suit from 17 of your former employees will be public knowledge. What do you want? Chairman Beck rasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "I want the keys," Kiera said. She leaned forward, the sapphire ring catching the light. "The Ghost King has acquired 41% of your outstanding shares since the market opened this morning. We are here to negotiate the transfer of the remaining controlling interest in exchange for the dissolution of the tax investigation files my team currently holds. The room went cold. It wasn't just a business deal. It was a total surrender. Kiera wasn't just taking their money. She was taking their name. She turned her gaze to Jia, who was trembling in the corner. You told me that I should remember the day I thought I could breathe the same air as your family, Kiera said, her tone devoid of any petty triumph, which made it all the more devastating. I remember it perfectly. It's the day I realized your air was actually quite thin. You used your status to silence people you thought were smaller than you. Today, I am using your status to give them a voice. Kiera slid a single document across the polished wood. It was a transfer of ownership for the restaurant group and the flagship fashion house. Sign it, Kiera commanded. Chairman Beck looked at Jinhua, searching for a shred of the Ghost King's usual ruthlessness, but he found only a man who was looking at his fiancée with a pride that was far more terrifying. The chairman realized then that he wasn't negotiating with a mafia boss. He was negotiating with a woman his wife had tried to ruin, and she was far more clinical in her retribution. As the chairman's pen hit the paper, the era of the Beck family officially ended. Kiera stood up, closing her portfolio with a sharp, final snap. She walked toward the door, pausing only for a moment beside the shell-shocked Jia. The white suit you were wearing at the restaurant? Kiera whispered. I've had it sent to the dry cleaners. I thought you might need it for your first day in court. Since you're so concerned with appearances, it's only fair you look your best when you lose everything. As Kiera and Jinhua walked out of the boardroom, the transition was complete. The waitress was gone, replaced by a woman who had just executed a hostile takeover of the very world that had tried to erase her. She hadn't used a slap. She had used a pen, and the ink was far harder to wash off than red wine. The transition from the boardroom to the streets of Itaewon was a shift from the cold sterility of high finance to the vibrant, messy pulse of a neighborhood that never slept. 6 months had passed since the day the Beck family's controlling interest was signed away, and the skyscraper that once served as the monument to Jia's vanity was being systematically hollowed out. But Kiera Mitchell wasn't interested in just taking down a sign. She was interested in building a foundation that could actually hold the weight of the people who had been ignored for too long. Kiera stood in front of a newly renovated 3-story brick building, the morning sun reflecting off the brass plaque by the entrance. The Kiera Foundation, Legal and Advocacy Center for International Workers. She wasn't wearing a server's vest, nor was she draped in the Iron King shadows. She wore a simple, tailored suit of cream linen, her braids gathered back, the salon sapphire on her finger catching the light like a small, blue sun. The building had been purchased with the liquidated assets of Beck Jia's private luxury portfolio. The proceeds from the sale of her rare handbags, the auction of her Cheongdam-dong penthouse, and the seizure of her offshore accounts. Every diamond Jia had used to cut Kiera's lip had been traded for the salaries of top-tier labor attorneys and human rights advocates. The first 10 cases are already in the system, Kiera, CO Jinhua said, stepping up beside her. He looked different in the daylight of Itaewon. The Ghost King aura was still there, a lethal stillness that made passersby instinctively give him space. But his eyes were focused entirely on the woman beside him. Most of them are service workers. Unpaid wages, visa threats, physical abuse by management. One of them is a young woman who was fired from a boutique in Cheongdam-dong for looking wrong in the uniform. Kiera looked at the doors as they opened, watching as a group of foreign workers. People of all backgrounds, many looking as tired and invisible as she had felt 6 months ago, began to filter inside. They didn't have to bow. They didn't have to apologize for existing. Jia told me that status was about who you could strike without consequences, Kiera said, her voice steady and warm. I wanted to prove that real status is about who you can protect. We didn't just take her money, Jinhua. We took her power and gave it back to the people she used it on. Jinhua reached out, his hand finding hers. The Underworld King, a man whose empire was built on the absolute control of the city's dark veins, was now the primary benefactor of its most visible light. He had realized that by funding Kiera's dream, he wasn't just laundering his reputation. He was finding a way to exist in a world where he didn't have to be a ghost. The Beck family name is officially gone from the registry, Jinhua noted, looking at the plaque. The fashion group has been rebranded. The restaurant group has implemented the fair wage policy you wrote. You haven't just opened a foundation, Kiera. You've shifted the center of gravity in this city. Inside the center, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the elite restaurants of Gangnam. There were no white-glove servers or $3,000 bottles of wine. Instead, there were desks filled with paperwork, the smell of fresh coffee, and the low, urgent hum of people being heard for the first time. Kiera walked through the lobby, stopping to speak with a young woman from the Philippines who was clutching a folder of contracts. Kiera didn't look down at her. She didn't look through her. She sat on the edge of a chair, level with the woman, and listened. As the day progressed, the center became a hive of activity. The news of the Waitress Queen and her foundation had spread through the expat communities like wildfire. For many, Kiera was more than a benefactor. She was a living proof that the hierarchy of Seoul could be broken. Late in the afternoon, Jinhua joined her in the small garden at the back of the center. The audit of the final Beck accounts is finished, he said. There's enough left over to open a second branch in Busan, if that's what you want. Kiera looked up at the sky, the blue deepening as evening approached. She thought about the cost of a spill and the cost to her dignity. The math was finally adding up in her favor. Not just Busan, she said, her eyes flashing with a quiet, regal ambition. I want one in every city where someone thinks their wealth gives them the right to put their hands on another human being. Jinhua smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. Then that's what we'll build. The Kiera Foundation was more than just a legal center. It was the physical manifestation of a power reversal. The woman who had been struck was now the one who provided the shield. And as the Ghost King stood beside her, the city began to realize that the most dangerous thing you could do in Seoul wasn't crossing the Mafia. It was underestimating the woman who held the Mafia boss's heart. The evening air outside Latoil was crisp, but inside, the atmosphere had been completely transformed. Gone was the suffocating arrogance of the old guard, replaced by a sophisticated, inclusive warmth that felt like a new heartbeat for the city. When the heavy oak doors opened, the restaurant didn't just fall silent. It stood at attention. Kiera Mitchell walked through the foyer, her hand resting lightly on CO Jinhua's arm. She was dressed in an understated gown of midnight silk that flowed like water with every step, the sapphire on her finger catching the amber light of the chandeliers. Beside her, the Ghost King walked with the quiet, lethal grace of a man who no longer needed to hide in the shadows to be seen. The manager, the same man who had once stood by while Kiera was struck, stepped forward. He didn't bow out of fear this time. He bowed with a deep, genuine reverence that recognized exactly who was walking toward him. Good evening, Ms. Mitchell. Chairman CEO, your table is ready. He didn't lead them to the corner booth, the shadow where the forgotten sat. He led them to the very center of the room, to the grand circular table beneath the central chandelier. It was the seat that had traditionally been reserved for the Beck family and their inner circle, the ultimate symbol of social dominance. As Kiera sat, the staff moved with a precision that was breathtaking. The head sommelier approached, not with a dismissive air, but with the focused dedication of an artisan. He presented a bottle of 1996 vintage, the same year Kiera's family had moved to Detroit, and poured it into fresh crystal with a hand that didn't tremble. Kiera looked around the room. She saw the new staff members, diverse, proud, and protected by the very foundation she had built. She saw the wealthy diners at the surrounding tables, who now watched her not with disdain, but with a cautious, newfound respect. They knew that the woman at the center table held the keys to their city's conscience. You look like you're thinking about the glass, Jinhua said softly, his obsidian eyes reflecting the candlelight. Kiera smiled, tracing the rim of her glass. I'm thinking about how far the wine has traveled, from a spill on the floor to a toast at the center of the room. It didn't travel alone, Jinhua replied, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. You carried it here, Kiera. You took a moment of absolute humiliation and turned it into a throne. The dinner was a slow, beautiful symphony. Every course was a tribute to the fusion of their worlds. French technique meeting bold, soulful flavors. The staff didn't just serve Kiera. They looked to her for approval, their eyes bright with the knowledge that their queen was one of their own. She was the woman who had walked the same marble floors with a heavy tray, and who now sat upon them with a heavy crown. As the evening drew to a close, Jinhua stood and walked around the table, offering his hand to Kiera. The room watched as the Ghost King and his queen prepared to depart. They weren't just leaving a restaurant, they were leading an era. Are you ready for what comes next? Jinhua whispered as they reached the doors. Kiera looked at the sapphire on her finger, then back at the center table, which remained the focal point of the room. I've spent my life waiting for a seat at the table, Jinhua. Now that I have the keys to the room, I think I'm ready to build a few more. As they stepped out into the Seoul night, the neon lights of the city seemed to glow a little brighter. The Ice Queen was a memory. The white suit was a rag, and the red wine had finally been washed away. In its place was a legacy of honor, a kingdom of kindness, and a waitress who had finally found her home at the head of the table. Kiera Mitchell's journey from the marble floor to the center table is a reminder that the world can try to stain your uniform, but it can never touch your soul. One slap was meant to break her, but instead, it became the spark that ignited a revolution of dignity in the heart of Seoul. What was your favorite part of Kiera's rise to power? Asterisk, was it the silent authority of Jinhua's first move? The clinical destruction of the Beck family's pride? Or the moment Kiera turned a legal center into a sanctuary for the invisible? Tell us in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts on justice and